Hello, and welcome to the Unwatchables, a show where we talk movies, but not just any movies. Here we discuss what we call one-timers and no-timers. One-timers being movies that we recommend seeing once, but aren't worth a second viewing, and no-timers being movies that you shouldn't waste a moment of your lives on. And remember, this is a spoiler-filled podcast, so be aware of that. I'm Kylie.
And I'm Marcus.
Welcome to the show. For this episode, we will be talking about Hunter Killer for our one-timer and The Mummy 2017 for our no-timer.
Alright, so first we're going to talk about Hunter Killer, the movie with Gerald Butler, Gary Oldman, and Common that came out in October. So Kylie, what were your thoughts about this movie?
Overall, the entire time, I thought that it was pretty cheesy. Bad CGI, it took me out of the film. But overall, it kept me entertained the entire time, and it was a 2-hour-long movie, so that's pretty impressive. So I think it is worth seeing once, but it was pretty cheesy, pretty common war movie.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it was like I know some of the reviews about it said it was very by-the-books type of film. So, I mean, in that regard, it was okay, but yeah, what you said is completely right. So this film, it basically follows like 3 different groupings. So there's the grouping of Gary Oldman and Common, and they're like in the State Department / like Department of Defense, and they're the ones that are the people that are in the command center, like giving out the commands or whatnot. Then you have Gerald Butler, he's on the submarine with everybody else. Then you have like a third plot, which is all these like Navy SEALs that are actually trying to save the Russian president from a coup that's just happened. And that's the one that really loses me. Like, I felt like that's the one that felt the most out of place. And it just made the movie just seem like it really drag on and just really boring, yeah?
I mean, I guess so. For me, I didn't think it was boring per se, but it took me out of it every single time because it felt like 2 separate plots, 2 separate movies. Because there was the search and rescue party, and then there was the war going on in the sea, I guess. So it was just 2 completely different sets of protagonists and antagonists, 2 completely different plots. And so each time that it would switch back, it would take me out of the one, and then once you jump back into the other one, you have to remember where you were and you have to pick up where you left off.
That's a fair point. I don't know. I feel like with this film, it's kind of a thing where if this film was on and you're at your sister's boyfriend's house for like Christmas or New Year's or something like that, and they have it on TV, I feel like you could be entertained if the TV is like really low and you're just hearing people talk in the background or you're talking to a friend or whatever. Yeah, paying attention to it, yeah, I don't know. It just, like, it kind of feels a bit like a propaganda piece. It also just, like, it's weird when you look back to this film. It was basically like principal shooting ended in like September, August of 2016. So the film basically shot 2 years ago. And during that time, one of the main actors died in the film. Well, the guy from John Wick, the main antagonist, he's in this film, and he's like a Russian military admiral or whatever. So like, he's dead. And then this film too, they have like this whole aspect of like they show the president in one scene, and it's a woman that looks a lot like Hillary Clinton. Like, this woman even wears the same outfit as Hillary Clinton. And I mean, like, I get it at the time when they filmed that they thought, oh, like, Hillary Clinton is probably going to win. But now when you look at it, it's like, oh, geez, this didn't age well. Like, those tweets where it's like, oh, that tweet didn't age well, saying something like, like Kevin Durant made the worst mistake of his life going like Golden State if there was such a tweet. Like, it ages badly, right? I feel like that Madam President thing really kind of aged badly. Like, what'd you think?
Well, yeah, it definitely did, because she wasn't in very many scenes. She was probably in the movie for less than 10 minutes, definitely. And so they had time and probably the means to do reshoots, but no one really bothered to think to do that. And so having this Madam President, it takes you out of the film because it makes you wonder why they made that choice, because most people viewing this probably wouldn't know that they shot it 2 years ago. So they wouldn't know that they were trying to model it based off reality. And so based off of that, it's just really confusing for people, and it probably takes a lot of people out of the film, which is what happened for me.
I totally agree. What do you think about like the aspect of, is Gerald Butler, is he a good actor? I feel weird about it because, like, I think he is a good actor, and he's been in some movies that I like, but he's been in so many movies that are either exactly the same or are bad.
I think, well, I haven't seen very many of his movies, but for this one, I think he is what they wanted him to be, which is just a super cliche loner military man. So I guess in that aspect, he is a good actor. But to me, just all the cheesy dialogue and everything really diminishes his performance.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that stereotype because literally in Olympus Has Fallen, or is it White? Yeah, I think it's Olympus Has Fallen. The two films that he did about saving the American president. There's Olympus Fallen and then there's London Has Fallen, and he saves the president twice. This is now the third film that Butler has saved a president. He's got one Russian one and two American ones under his belt now. And I feel like he's done like 6 movies that are literally exactly the same. He did a movie that came out a year ago. It's called Geostorm. And the idea is like the world governments have gone together and they create these like series of machines or satellites to control the weather on the planet. And like he has to save the world because one of these machines has gone awry and it's like killing people now. So I mean, those 4 films are exactly the same. Like he has exactly the same personality in each 4 films. He's a guy that's been reprimanded by the government. He's kind of looked upon as like a black sheep, but he's incredibly capable and like he saves the day at the end. Like it is literally, he has exactly the same lines. He has the same accent. He does everything exactly the same in those 4 films.
Yeah, this is definitely a cookie cutter film, and I even wrote down a couple of the lines of dialogue, and they were all from him too, except for one, I think. And the first one being when they rescued the Russian captain, he said, "We're no different, you and I," which I've heard 10,000 times. And then in the end, someone asked him, "How'd you know, Captain?" And he says, "I didn't." But they, they just barely escaped, and it's just all these like military movie tropes that are copied over and over. And this, I feel like this movie just had all of them.
It really, honestly, when I can't draw Butler, it really did. What'd you think about Gary Oldman in this film? I almost just feel like they told Gary Oldman like, "You'll make $1 million and you have to film for 6 days." Like I feel like you could have swapped him out for anybody. He doesn't do anything in the movie. Like you could have put a far lesser actor in that role.
No, he played the cheesy, angry military man. That's what he was. He just got angry all the time and was basically a catalyst for the war, I suppose, for taking the first shot against the Russian submarine.
Yeah, like in the beginning, there's like the one Russian and American subs that get shot or torpedoed out of the water. Mm-hmm. Like, I feel like Gary Oldman, it's really weird because I feel like, again, here's a guy that is like a good actor. He's been in several films where he's very good in it. I mean, he won an Academy Award last year. And I feel like he's been in a number of films also that suck, that have come out in the last like 10 years. For example, like what was it? The Hitman's Bodyguard. Do you see it with Ryan Reynolds and Samuel Jackson? And that film, it's like Gary Oldman is a Russian oligarch that wants to overthrow the Russian government, and Ryan Reynolds and Samuel Jackson kill him in the end of the film. But it like he has one of those fake cheesy Russian accents, and he's terrible in the film. Like he's like laughably bad, and he's been in a number of films like that where he's just either pointless or stupid. It's really incredible considering like how good that he is.
Yeah, I mean, they definitely spent the budget hiring good actors, but I think that in doing that, they were lacking in CGI and screenwriting and everything else that they needed to actually make a film that was worth seeing. So I guess that's a good example of misuse of budget.
Yeah,
because he really could have been anybody.
Yeah, he could have been a literal unknown actor, an actor that's just been in like TV movies, or you pull one of those whatever like NYPD shows or Chicago PD. You just pull a chief or just an angry older military guy, or that plays that kind of character, and just slapped him in that role.
I think that when you see a good actor in a bad role, that's another thing that takes you out of the film. And there was just so much about this movie that was really jarring. That, and another example that I can think of is all of the the Russian military and even the president and everyone, they all spoke in English to each other rather than speaking in Russian with subtitles, which I thought was such a weird choice to make. And I can't really think of any reason to do that, because it's not like they were in the presence of other English people for most of the film. They were, and even in the end when the Russian admiral was speaking to the men on his ship, he was speaking to them in English.
Yeah.
And he was making this really heartfelt speech to them, and you would think that he would say it in his own language, so that there wouldn't be any sort of language barrier or anything, and so it would have more meaning for him and his men, but no, it was in English.
I just sort of wanted to make it easier for audiences, which you're right, like it kind of takes away the element of authenticity.
Yeah, and do they think that we can't read subtitles?
Yeah, I mean, you don't even, like you said, you don't have to have that many subtitles. It's like 2 minutes of the whole movie, maybe. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you raised a really good point. Like, I was thinking of the aspect of, like, how many good actors have been in bad movies, and the first one that comes to my mind is Anthony Hopkins in Transformers 5. That was actually the worst performance I've ever seen from a good actor in a bad movie.
No way.
Yeah, because he was actually horrible in that movie. Like, there's scenes where, like, he's cursing at his driver robot. He has a driver that's a robot or transformer. And he's, like, cursing at people, and, like, they're running over people, and he's like, get out of that effing way or whatever. And, like, I know Gary Oldman in this film isn't that bad, but, like, there certainly has to be a list of good actors in bad movies that somehow have actually become bad actors in good movies, or bad movies.
Yeah, I mean, I guess they just become sellouts at some point.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Do you think that this film, did it have, like, a little bit of an element of promoting a new Cold War?
It seemed like it, because I remember during the movie there were scenes of just stock footage from the military.
Oh, there was.
And,
that was weird.
And we saw that together, and you pointed that out right away, and it was just super weird. And so it seems like it definitely was. It did have a propaganda element to it.
That stock footage, the first thing I think of when I see stock footage for military, like military stock footage in films, is Plan 9 from Outer Space, when the stock footage is just horrible. So immediately in my mind I thought, oh my gosh, like, this looks so stupid. But yeah, I mean this has been going on ever since the 90s, where for Hollywood, there has to be villains that you don't have to describe a lot of, right? So World War II movies, the Nazis are the bad guys. You don't have to go further in depth. It's just they're the bad guys. And, since the 90s, it's just been the Russians often. It's, the Russians. Just the Russians. I mean, you can't... I think it'd be too on the nose for a lot of these studios to do Islamic terrorism. Because then, there would be more of a backlash, right? Or there'd maybe fear for their lives or whatever. So it's like, let's just do the Russians. They're like the go-to bad guys in all these films. But now, like, when you hear all this stuff about, politicians wanting to actually, like, start a war with Russia, how there's talks about that, then it kind of, to me, it kind of feels like it's crossing over into that territory a little bit of actual propaganda a little bit, because it's like, yeah, Russians bad. Now for a generation we've heard this, and I feel like for this film too, a lot of films that focus on military matters, they get funding from the military, or the military will donate their, like, crafts to them to use for free. So, like, for example, like, I know, like, in, like, Transformers and stuff, like, there's all those, I don't know, destroyers. So, like, when they have the big marine vessels, like in films, oftentimes the Navy will donate that so that they can actually use it in the film for, like, no charge or anything. And in a sense, like, I know that a lot of films have had that where they get funding directly from the army or the government. And I know for sure in this film, because the film has a $40 million budget, at least I was listening online, for Hunter Killer, I just feel like they got to use a lot of stuff for free. Or the military helped them finance the film. So that again, that kind of makes it weird, because if that's true, then that means that some American dollars are spent on promoting a film that was, like, purposely trying to, like, stoke a war a little bit with Russia. And I'm not saying it has to be that deep in thought, where there's not, like, necessarily a conspiracy there, or there's not something that's intrinsically saying, oh, look at this, there's something crazy or spooky happening. I'm not necessarily insinuating that, but what I am insinuating is that, like, why? Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I guess it's just a big thing I kind of walked away with.
I think that you also have to think about the time that it was filmed, which was in
Yeah.
2016 with the whole election and everything, and how people were making it seem as though, the Russians were involved with the election and everything, and so that was a pretty stereotypical bad guy in the real world, I suppose.
Mm.
And so I guess if you look at it that way, that's a good way to recruit for the military if this was for propaganda purposes. But again, the fact that it's released in 2018 makes it really outdated, which is just
Yeah.
another problem with the film.
I totally agree there.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I mean, for this film, like Kaya mentioned earlier, I mean, the film it's not terrible. I mean, it's all right. I mean, I guess by default, it's the best submarine movie in the last 15 years. Because I can't think of any other that have come out in the last 15 years. But, I mean, if we're talking, like, in comparison to The Hunt for Red October or, the other ones that came out in the 80s, this film is not as good as those.
Well, I can't speak from seeing those other movies, but I thought that this movie had pretty good pacing because, like I said, I was constantly entertained. I was never bored by the movie. So I think that the editing was done well in terms of storyline, besides the two separate plot issues that we had. But I also liked their cinematography because they made use of the Dutch angle, where they frame it kind of sideways, and they use that in the submarine a lot, which sort of entailed that there was danger coming and whatnot, and so they made good use of that. And yeah, I mean, I was never bored.
All right, well, I guess that's it for Hunter Killer. So the next film we're going to talk about is The Mummy 2017 with Tom Cruise. So Kylie, what were your thoughts about this film overall?
I can honestly say that I don't have anything positive to say about this film because everything about it was either just really cheesy, had horrible special effects, or just an overall terrible screenplay. So I think it's definitely a no-timer. What about you?
This movie to me seems like a big like corporate horror type of a movie in that like the whole point of this film existing is to set up the dark universe, right? And obviously we're not the first people to talk about the concept of the dark universe totally failing and like not even gonna launch. But I mean, now that we're like a year and a half removed from when the film came out, or almost a year and a half removed, I mean, you can really look back and just think, like, just watching it just stand alone. Yeah, there's just so many things about it that are just so off and just so off-putting. And it's really weird because I feel like Tom Cruise has had a really good run the last, like, 10 years. I feel like every film he's been in, like, I very much like him. Or he has a couple films they're kind of like stinkers, like that Rock movie that he was in that kind of, like, wasn't great. But he's been in a lot of films, especially Tom Cruise action films, have been really good. Oblivion, The Edge of Tomorrow, the last several Mission Impossible movies. They're very good, solid action Tom Cruise movies. And this Mummy film, in a sense, felt like a Tom Cruise action movie, right? Like, it had a lot of the tropes of a Tom Cruise action film. I mean, there's something to do with a plane. There's him running. There's him doing action stuff. It's a very Tom Cruise action star type of movie. And I guess when you mix it with The Mummy, you end up with a bad result. I don't know how else to describe it. It just very, very weird. I mean,
Yeah, it's weird because if you go into it not knowing that it's the start of the Dark Universe, it's a horrible standalone film. And do you think that they maybe would have had more success if they had started with Invisible Man or Dracula or one of the other films first?
yeah, I mean, I feel like with The Invisible Man, I feel like there's a lot more to work with in the sense that people they're not that familiar with the property. Because I guess you could say The Hollow Man was a true Invisible Man remake, I guess. Like, that movie came out around like 2000, 2001 or 2 or something like that. And it has Kevin Bacon in it. And it's basically that plot is he becomes an invisible man over time. But before that film, I mean, the only Invisible Man that most people really think about is one that came out in the 1940s. I think it was 1940s or late 30s. And it had Vincent Price was the voice of the Invisible Man. But that happened so many years ago, and that film is a little cheesy even then for that time. And I think a lot of people don't really know a lot about the Invisible Man, so there's a lot more to work with. You can put your stamp on it more. But with The Mummy, this is I mean, I guess depending on how you look at it, this is like the fifth vision of the Mummy film. So you had the first one that has Karloff as the Mummy, and that first one, like, he's not even in the wrappings. And then you have the second iteration, which is Lon Chaney Jr. playing the Mummy. He's basically a serial killer, and those films came out in the 40s. Then you have the Hammer movies that came out like in the 50s, 60s, which is again another Mummy thing. And then you have Brendan Fraser's that were the late 90s, early thousands, which are total just action films, and especially the second and third ones, they're very action horror elements. But the first one, yeah, I mean, that the first one that came out, Brendan Fraser, whatever it was, 97 or late 90s, it was, you know, it was kind of, you know, it was horror elements, but it still was kind of action, and young kids could see it, or at least children could watch it, and adults. And so this is like the fifth vision, which is to try to do more similar to what they did with Brendan Fraser, and maybe something akin to Mummies 1 or 2. But yeah, for this, I mean, so you kind of have all those elements that you have to consider, right? The Mummy has this long history to an extent. So you're kind of having to make a movie that's modern, but, you know, in the same token, you don't want to disregard everything that's come before it. And yeah, for this film, for Mummy 2017, it just feels like, yeah, they just kind of threw a lot of things into it. They said, oh, so we got a Tom Cruise action film. All right, check. Then we're going to make it like the new twist on the Mummy. Let's have it a female Mummy, right? So let's throw that in. And it's like, oh, okay, that's interesting. And that was about it. That's about all they did for the plot.
And they randomly also threw in Mr. Hyde.
Yeah.
With Dr. Jekyll?
Yeah, Jekyll. Yeah, so it's like, Jekyll? So in this film, right, like, and you allude to sort of like the dark universe idea, right? So it's just going to be, and again, even the dark universe from Universal, that's not even like a new idea. There's already been something like the dark universe. I mean, if you look back, especially like Universal Studios, like around like the 50s or 40s, or not studios, just Universal, they did crossovers. They did Wolfman versus Frankenstein, and there was films where there's Wolfman, Frankenstein, and Dracula. And they've already done crossover films. So when they were going to do the Dark Universe, which was supposed to be this big Avenger-style cinematic universe, so they like what you mentioned. So they introduced Mr. Hyde and Dr. Jekyll, played by Russell Crowe, and that's another character similar to the Invisible Man, where a lot of people don't know anything about Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde. All they know is a concept of a doctor that can transform into like a crazy person, very similar to the Hulk. Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde is very similar to the Hulk, where you have a brilliant scientist, and then he loses control and becomes this uncontrollable monster, so to speak. Or at least in this film, that's how they portray Mr. Hyde, was Russell Crowe couldn't control it, and then, you know, he kind of became like a ravenous monster. But the problem is, Russell Crowe as Dr. Jekyll is kind of like an a-hole already to begin with. So it's really hard to tell the difference between a character as like a jerk or an a-hole, and then transforming into like a bigger a-hole. It's not a very defined difference.
Yeah, and it was confusing for me because I went in not knowing about the Dark Universe. And so we start off the film with just a ridiculous amount of exposition, and Russell Crowe is narrating, which I immediately thought was weird because at that point we didn't know that he was Dr. Hyde, Dr. Jekyll. Am I saying that right?
Yeah, Jekyll, yeah.
Jekyll. And so there was, I was really confused why he was narrating because he's not one of the main characters. If anything, I would figure that Tom Cruise would. And then I also think that he didn't really serve any purpose to the plot other than to have the princess escape, because for whatever reason, Tom Cruise's character, he took his serum from him because he was in an argument with him. And so he started to turn, and then, you know, just everything started to hit the fan. And so the princess escapes, and that seemed to be the only purpose that he served, is he was the catalyst for her freedom. And then he sort of disappeared for the rest of the film. And because I also didn't know that he was sort of like the, you know, Nick Fury of the MCU, I didn't realize how important he was. I was also confused about his serum and what kind of a serum could suppress an evil alter ego, and I also wondered why he would have a shot and why he wouldn't set up some sort of a drip system like an IV or into his arm, and I don't know, I
There's a
felt a
lot of
lot of
questions like that.
I just had a lot of questions, yeah, a lot of weird plot holes, a lot of things that I thought made the characters seem kind of stupid.
What this film definitely suffered from, you're completely right. Every point that you just made was very accurate. I just feel like this film, what it really suffers from the most is Universal pushing it to be released early, and then also the people working on the film. So I mean, obviously if you're listening to this, you probably know the fact that when the first Mummy trailer was released, it didn't even have audio, or they didn't even do the sound editing for the scene where Tom Cruise is in the plane and it's crashing. They didn't edit it correctly, so you just kind of hear like Tom Cruise going just kind of screaming a little bit, but it's just like it's empty sound around it, so it's really weird. So I mean, people have already pointed out the fact that The Mummy was rushed. It was incredibly rushed, and they've already cast all these actors to the Dark Universe, like Javier, gosh, I can't remember his name. They cast him to be but I know Johnny Depp was supposed to be in it. Angelina Jolie was supposed to be in it. Obviously, Russell Crowe and Tom Cruise were already attached to play all these roles. And yeah, they just rushed it. So I think that was one big problem with this film, was the rushing of it, and then who was in charge of it. So the person that directed it was Alex Kurtzman, and he only has one other director credit to his name, which, I mean, it was a film that tanked or bombed like 6 years ago with Chris Pine. Every other thing he's worked on, he's been the writer for a bunch of different films, and he's written scripts, I guess, or he's written screenplays for some good films, but then he's also been involved with a lot of crap. I mean, he's involved in multiple Transformers movies. I mean, he did the Star Trek movies, which are fine, but he did like the screenplay for Cowboys versus Aliens. It came out with Daniel Craig like 7 years ago, and I just don't think that he's a very good director. I feel like this film, even with everything we've already mentioned, if you had a good director or a good screenplay, if you were to mix that with all these other elements, I think you could have had a pretty decent film, or at least a decent Tom Cruise action film. You have to look at a movie like Oblivion. I feel like this movie could have been as good as Oblivion or Edge of Tomorrow if everything had come together correctly. But instead, they rushed it, and they shoehorn in a bunch of stuff, and then results is just like, oh wow, this movie felt rushed, and it is stupid.
Yeah, I think they really would have benefited from more time and definitely a better cast, because Tom Cruise's character Nick, he had a love interest, Jenny, and she didn't really serve much of a purpose in the film other than to be his love interest. But for me, that was such a problem because there was such a lack of chemistry between them that I just really didn't buy it. And then there was also Jack Johnson as his sidekick, which was confusing because I understand that he was sort of made to be the comedic relief, but this movie didn't feel like a comedy at all because it was a thriller and it also had some horror elements, which is fine, I guess, because a lot of horror movies do have comedic relief, but when it's also an action movie, usually they don't. And so it felt really out of place, and Jack Johnson's character he just kind of seemed like a wimp because he was supposed to be, I guess, was he a military man? He was
he was also he was like in part of Tom Cruise's unit or whatever, or part of Tom Cruise's military group that in the beginning of the film, right, when they do the expedition, right, and they find the tomb, which they later put on the plane, which then causes Jake Johnson and Tom Cruise to die in the plane wreck, right? Yeah, he is a wimp. And I just think that actor's a huge douchebag. I mean, I don't mean anything personal against him. I've never met him, but every film I ever see him in, he just really rubs me the wrong way. Like in Jurassic World, he was just really annoying. And then he's in the movie Tag that came out earlier this year. I actually kind of like Tag. That had John Hamm and Jeremy Renner and Ed Helms as well. And I just don't like watching him on screen. And I just feel like what he represents, he's the everyday slob that's a pothead a little bit, right? Like he's the guy that in a film would be the guy that like lives with his mom and does pot, and he would be great in like he would be great in Pineapple Express 2 is who he is. And you juxtapose him with Tom Cruise, who's a 55-year-old guy that's in incredible shape. He eats sugar once a month, runs every day, and it's just, they completely mix like fire and water, or gas, or like oil and water. And you're right, like this love interest in Tom Cruise, I mean, if there's anything true to the rumors about Tom Cruise being gay, the chemistry he has with the woman, Jenny, and Mummy, you could certainly read into that because there is absolutely no chemistry between the two of them. And there's no chemistry between Tom Cruise and Jake Johnson and Russell Crowe in that film. He looks like and he acts like in that film like your dad. If you have a dad that's 55 to 65, that like is kind of like not in great shape a little bit and kind of a little boring. That's who Russell Crowe is in this film. You just slap him in there. So when the fight scene between Tom Cruise and Russell Crowe happens, it's ridiculous. Because here we have again Tom Cruise. We see him in the film with his shirt off in incredibly good shape. And we have Russell Crowe that like is gasping for air probably in between takes when he's just walking around the room, theoretically throwing Tom Cruise from one side to another. And it just makes for a really weird mix.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that just comes back to the point I made earlier that they really should have made different casting decisions.
Yeah, that certainly would have helped. Yeah, especially the love interest. And that's another thing, too, that was weird about this because so the main mummy now is a woman. And, I mean, maybe like I was reading into it incorrectly, but I feel like there's a little bit of like unintentional sexual tension between her and Tom Cruise. Like, did you get that vibe at all?
Yeah, I think it was intentional though because she needed him to be some sort of conduit for Set, the god that
that was right. Yeah,
she sold her soul to or something like that, and I guess that was sort of done in a sexual way. And another thing is the way that she would possess people and kill them is she would kiss them.
Oh yeah,
she
suck the life out of them
just
like that.
Yeah, through their mouths. And so she was just sort of a sexual character, I guess, in that way. And to me, it felt a little bit sexist to me just because, I don't know, it was like in ancient times, I feel like a woman expressing sexuality would have made her like be shunned, which she basically was. She was mummified alive.
Yeah.
And so that frustrated me a little bit, and I also really saw no reason for her to have to make out with her victims to kill them. I thought that was really weird. So a lot about the antagonist just sort of rubbed me the wrong way.
Well, I mean, she's got almost a little bit of like, I feel like we've seen that happen with other female antagonists, where like they suck the life out of you through your mouth. But also kind of reminds me a little bit of Poison Ivy, because Poison Ivy has the toxic kiss that can kill you.
Oh yeah.
I don't know if you remember in Batman, they called it Batman and Robin, which is Batman #4 by Joel Schumacher. Like, to combat Poison Ivy from killing them, Robin and Batman wore like a plastic layer of protection over their lips so they wouldn't die from Poison Ivy's kiss, which is really a weird idea, but like, no, you're right. Like, they kind of reminded me of that a little bit. And yeah, I mean, it really was a weird depiction of it. I mean, I feel like, I don't know, I mean, maybe somebody could counter-argue and say, well, look at Dracula. I mean, that's like sexual nature, right? Because especially like in the original book and, the first films that came out, there was a very sexual predatory nature to how Dracula would act, right? Which was, he would go after like young girls, right? Or not like children, but like, like women that were like in their 20s or late teen years, right? And he would, have a seductive bite on their neck, right? So then people could say, well, look at Dracula. Like, that was sexual nature. Like, how is this any different from the mummy girl who sucks your life out of your mouth?
Mm-hmm.
But, I mean, it was really, I mean, like, again, this film wanted to be something similar to Brendan Fraser's Mummy, right? And if you remember in Brendan Fraser's Mummy, the first one that came out, like, if you remember how that mummy came to life, he would steal the body parts off of people and suck the life out of them in a different way. So he was just, he kind of like, he would stand in front of them and just kind of like absorb them and stuff. And I think like one guy, he stole the guy's tongue and that became his tongue, which was kind of like a cool, scary element. It's like, wow, this guy is kind of scary. Mm-hmm. But then you're right, like in this, she sucks the life out of him and then it just ends up being like a CG corpse. And it just didn't even look scary.
No, it was weird. It kind of reminded me of World War Z a little bit with the horrible CGI and the weird zombies in that movie. And another thing, too, that just didn't really add up with this is there was a moment where Princess Amunet, she had Jenny, like, pinned up against a wall or something. And I thought, oh, she's going to suck her life out because she's been doing that to everyone else. But instead, she just threw her across the room because of reasons.
Yeah.
No reason.
Well, because, like, yeah. I mean, no, that's incredibly good. But, like, she ends up killing Jenny, right? Because then Tom Cruise brings Jenny back to life. I will say that is actually one scene I actually kind of thought was cool towards the end when, like, Tom Cruise and Jenny are swimming in the water and the zombies are swimming behind them. Because that was all practical and that looked kind of cool. She was not a great antagonist, and she did. I think this film too, they kind of went a little too far over the top. So it's one thing for her to kill people on a small scale, and I think, okay, it's kind of cool, whatever. But then when she goes to London, and she does the gigantic sand wave and consumes like huge swaths of London, now like you've gone too far now, right? Now, I would think in my mind that the CIA or MI6 or whatever, like international secret government type of stuff, would come to Russell Crowe and be like, what are you doing here, right? Like, we have to know because we just got a sand blast in London. Like, what the heck was that, right? And yeah, there's this, I feel like she kind of fluctuated between like how powerful she was too, which is also like, typically in movies, right, they set the universe in place in which they create their own rules, right? But once you create the rules or set up the rules, you have to abide by your own rules that you set up. And I feel like for this, she would kind of fluctuate in how powerful she was, which also kind of made it like a little, like, it was off-putting in that sense, because if the movie's not going to follow its own logic that it's created, then it's really hard, I believe, as an audience member to actually follow a movie's logic when they don't even follow it.
Yeah, because there was, that moment you were talking about in London when she'd created this giant sandstorm when she was chasing after Nick, and it just made me wonder why she needed him at all, because she seems so powerful already.
Yeah.
And then there was the part in the woods where she's coming after him, and then I guess the military forces or whatever they are, they come and they just shoot a bunch of arrows into her or something like that, and they take her down, and then she's completely subdued. Yeah. And so, there's just a total lack of continuity with her powers.
Yeah, the powers totally fluctuate.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if that was meant to keep her unpredictable, but there's just a complete faulty logic to it.
Yeah, you have to remain, you completely, in these types of films, you have to remain consistent. If you're not, then it takes you out of the film. But another thing I wanted to mention or talk about is the aspect of this film, in my opinion, and I don't think I'm the first one to say this, is that it completely rips off the idea or an idea from American Werewolf in London. In that film, American Werewolf in London, the main character, his best friend gets killed by a werewolf towards the beginning of it, and that friend comes to the main character on a number of occasions as a corpse, telling him, you should kill yourself and you have all these powers and you're a bad guy, right? And his friend was like a corpse, but only he could see his dead friend. In this film, they totally copied the same exact thing with Tom Cruise and his Jake Johnson, that actor. Like, that actor does the same thing where he's showing up and he's dead, and they're in a bathroom together and he's talking to him in the mirror. He's like, but he's dead. It's literally, I've only seen that in 2 films ever, where a person gets killed by an evil entity, and then like the main character knows that guy, and then the dead friend keeps coming back and like explaining things to them, and it was such a ripoff. I mean, a literal total ripoff of that idea. It's not like American Werewolf in London. It's not like it's a film that's totally obscure, no one's ever heard of. I mean, I know it came out almost 40 years ago, but I mean, to copy that idea, I just feel like it was like really just so obvious, and like that was also I just thought, I'm like, wow, what a gigantic ripoff.
It was also completely unnecessary too, because there's the scene where Nick is in the bar and his dead friend comes to him in the mirror, and he's basically a conduit for Aminette, because he's explaining sort of her plans, or her, basically he's just explaining her plans to Nick and telling him to be aware and to watch out, and it's kind of a warning, but he's her conduit because he's kind of her inside man. She was controlling him in the beginning when she possessed him, but then it becomes completely unnecessary, because in the very next scene he walks out of the bar and she appears in front of him. So not only is it a ripoff, but it is completely pointless. And even though it's supposed to be comedic relief, it totally falls flat as well.
You're right on every point. I mean, I just feel like with this film, this is like quintessential. Some studio exec, they saw all how much money all these MCU movies are making, and they thought to themselves, we gotta copy this. We gotta do whatever we have, whatever properties we own that we can make into a cinematic universe, we're gonna make into one, so we can cash in on this. And that's why last year in 2017, you saw the DCEU, which is DC's version of the MCU. You saw the Dark Universe try to launch or whatever. And that's why I believe it was last year, a couple years ago, you also had the concept of the Transformers cinematic universe. So if the Bumblebee movie is successful, if that makes money, then that will then begin the process of the Transformers cinematic universe. And the problem is, I think, with all these studios, that they don't understand the concept that the MCU isn't successful because, these characters are all in one cinematic universe together. They're not successful because of that. They're successful because people like the characters in the movies. And I think for the MCU, that they had an idea in their mind where they wanted to eventually go. Like, this big crossover film, right? Or these crossover films. But they never really put the wagon before the cart. Or wagon before the horse. Like, they kind of built it up. So each film, especially in the beginning, are their own independent films where you can watch them and enjoy them by themselves. Like Iron Man 1 is a film that if they never made a sequel to it, you could watch it and enjoy it in and of itself. I mean, it has a self-contained plot that you can kind of enjoy. And, you look at even, Captain America or Thor 1, even though I don't necessarily care for Thor 1, there's self-contained plots where there's a story arc. Like a character enters the film one way and he ends the film in a different position, right? Like there's things that actually happen to him. There's plot, there's love interest, there's self-contained stories. And I think all these other cinematic universes have tried to replicate the idea of the cinematic universe without actually having to do the work of building like a love interest, let's say, or building up a character to actually learn who he is and what he does. I mean, in this film, all we know about Tom Cruise is that he's a military guy, and by the end of the film, the only thing that's changed is that he now has powers. And in the DCU films, it's, you had one Superman film that everybody didn't like, and then you throw in a Batman that like changed in all of the dumbest reasons. And now the DCU is, I guess, dead. I mean, we'll have to see, I guess, how Aquaman does, if they're going to continue it or not. But, I mean, with all these cinematic universes, they're just so, I don't know, they're just so, like, they want to cash in on something that they had nothing to do with creating. And I don't really think that they've actually yielded results or even made good films, ultimately.
Yeah, and you brought up a lot of points that I wanted to talk about. With Marvel, they started over 10 years ago, and they took a chance with Robert Downey Jr. and with making a high-budget film, but they took, 10 years to build up this universe, whereas I feel like with DC and especially with this Dark Universe, they rushed it and they didn't take the time to build upon characters to make good standalone films, which if they had, who knows, they could have yielded way different results.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're completely right. I mean, I don't know, with the Mummy film, I feel like with Hunter Killer, and the difference between that and the Mummies, I feel like with Hunter Killer, I don't know how you could have made that movie a 10 out of 10. I mean, yeah, you could have maybe cut out the stuff with the Navy SEALs, and maybe if you had tighter writing and a better director, you could have made that film an 8 out of 10 maybe. But I think that's the cap of how good Hunter Killer could have been. I feel like with Mummy, that's a film that maybe you could say on a scale of 1 to 10 is maybe like a 2. And I think one reason why that makes a Mummy more disappointing than Hunter Killer is that there's so much potential for like a good Mummy movie, because we've seen Tom Cruise do so many good movies recently. The Mummy is a character that a lot of people know about. There's a lot of lore that you can draw from, and you could make a really good Mummy movie if they had put the time and effort into it. But instead, they just kind of slapped something together, and some, the board members at Universal were like, well, how's that Mummy movie coming along? What are we going to do for it? And it's like, oh, well, let's cast the guy that wrote Star Trek Into Darkness to be the director. Oh, okay. And who's going to star in it? Well, Tom Cruise. It's going to be a Tom Cruise action Mummy movie. And that was it. And, they would watch the dailies, or they would watch, the film before, on the editing room, and they thought, oh yeah, this looks fine. This makes a lot of sense, and for pretty much almost no reason, we're gonna jump from Egypt to London, and this makes the movie look so. I mean, I don't. I just feel like there's so many things that you could make this movie a great movie if they had put the time and effort into it, but since they didn't, it just makes it like a waste of time to watch. I mean, I really honestly, I don't know how anybody could actually enjoy this film. Like, you would have to literally be, you would have to have this movie on like a volume level of 3 at your house and be playing on your cell phone, or be listening to music while you're working on your laptop or something to actually enjoy this film. I mean, this is literally outside of just moving pictures on the background on your TV at home. I don't see how you can get any enjoyment from this film.
I don't either. It has flat characters. It takes, I think, the first 8 to 10 minutes of the film are all just exposition, with the telling the story of Aminette and with a newscast reel and things like that, where they could have taken the time to, start the film with Tom Cruise's character and his friend on their expedition. And then throughout the film, they could have had, flashbacks, or they could have just had the characters explain it, have Aminette tell her story, just whatever, things like that. But they didn't need 10 minutes of Russell Crowe narrating the exposition. I just thought that was really cheap and put together really poorly. And I think that was my main problem with the film and why the story was so poor.
Yeah, I mean, it's really weird. I feel like with Russell Crowe, I mean, it's kind of sad when you see older, like, he's not even an older actor, but it's sadder to see actors that have been around for a little while, and then they kind of hit, like, a rough patch of a bunch of bad movies straight. But honestly, I was thinking about that, like, since 2010, let's say, he hasn't really been in that many good movies, or the movies that he's been in that have been good, he has not been good in them. Like Les Mis, for example, right? Mm-hmm. Everybody criticized the fact that he couldn't sing in that and looked terrible in the movie. And I know he was in the film. Gosh, I wish I could remember the name. I think it was The Good Guys or The Bad Guys. It was with Ryan Gosling. It came out like 2.5 years ago, and they're both like cops. Or I think Russell Crowe was a detective. I think maybe they're both detectives. And that film was like all right. I mean, Russell Crowe wasn't really great. I just feel like I haven't seen Russell Crowe be good in a movie in like a long time, and this film certainly continues that trend of a not good Russell Crowe like film. I mean, I don't know what he's gonna do next. I mean, he's a rich dude, and The Gladiator bought him a lot of really goodwill. Mm-hmm. So I mean, people they remember that the most for him. But yeah, I mean, it's almost a little bit now. He has a little bit of some thing as Gerald Butler, in that you look at him and you kind of begin to criticize or question the idea of like, are they actually good actors? Gerald Butler has been in one film or maybe 2 films that are universally liked: 300 and Phantom of the Opera. So you got one film for guys, one film for girls. So that's what people like him for that. Russell Crowe has, like, I mean, he's got more than 2, but the last one that he was in that just blew people away was probably at least 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. I mean, we were talking about like A Beautiful Mind, or I mean, I know he's done several like in the like early thousands, 90s that were good, but I mean, yeah, it might be Russell Crowe's last really good movie might be American Gangster, which was 2007, and I don't even think a lot of people even remember that movie with Denzel.
Yeah, I guess that's kind of a common theme for this show, is actors falling off and becoming sellouts.
Yeah, or just
kind of a bummer.
Or just not being good anymore. It's sad though, because I mean, Russell Crowe. I mean, he's an actor that threw a telephone at someone in real life. You'd think he could bring some of that passion to some of these roles, but apparently not.
I feel like that's about it for this one.
Yeah, I guess, yeah. So, definitely The Mummy is a no-timer. Yeah, so join us next week as we talk about more unwatchable movies, one-timers and no-timers. Kylie, thank you for being on today.
All right, we'll see you next week.